Okay, welcome to this latest installment of an introduction to arguments for the existence of God for year 10. I do see, I hope you're doing well. This is really for Thursday or Friday this week, and it's the 12 tasks of Asterix as regards the design argument. If you've read Asterix and you're familiar with that canon of great literature, have a look at this crash course video here, which will introduce you to the whole design argument. But it really goes back to Aquinas and indeed to Aristotle, I suppose, to some degree. But William Paley in the 19th century really takes hold of the argument and presents it forcibly. In 1802, he wrote Natural Theology. It was the book that Charles Darwin was reading on his voyage to the Galapagos Islands because he was interested in design. And Paley has some interesting ideas. He's particularly interested in this comparison or analogy between the eye and the world. He thinks that there's a connection in terms of design, and also between the eye and a watch. And he thinks that both the watch and the world, or the eye, are regular. They've got complex parts that interlock together to serve a purpose. The watch tells the time, the eye gives us sight, and the world is part of a solar system that moves in perfect orbit together. He has a mechanistic view of the universe, and he thinks that it's finely tuned and orderly. It's regular as clockwork, and this, to his mind, points to a designer. And so there's a famous passage in which he writes this: in crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. But suppose I'd found a watch upon the ground, and that it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think the answer which I had given before, that for anything I knew the watch might have always been there. Yet why should this not answer serve for the watch as well as the stone? Why is it not admissible in the second case as in the first? For this reason, and no other, that when we look to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose, that they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion is regulated to point out the hour of the day, that if the different parts have been differently shaped from where they are, or a different size to what they are, or placed after another manner, either no motion would have carried out in the machine, or none which would have answered to the use of it now saved. So imagine the orbits of the planets meant that they collided with each other every sort of 100 or 1,000 years, or every 24 hours, then there would be no solar system. Everything is in perfect order as far as Paley can see. Paley is interested as well. He says, the thumb, if you think about it, could have been anywhere. It could have been pointing at the side of our head, but it's opposed to the other fingers. It makes a perfect pincer movement, and that can enable us to make tools, and therefore there must be a God. So Paley in the 19th century is struck by the order of nature and how beautiful it is. So the first task is, what do you think about the reasonableness of his argument? And can you think of any objections to it? Now, the second task is to look at the eye and discuss ways in which it might be seen to evidence Paley's theory, that it displays regularity and purpose. Now, the eye has an optic nerve that goes through to the brain. It has a lens, an iris. It has muscles that can contract or extend the eye. It can dilate the pupil to let more or less light in. When Newton was doing his study of optics, he would take what's equivalent to a knitting needle and kind of prod the eye to see how the muscles could contract it. So it's a mechanism. And for Paley, this was supremely designed like a modern camera, with immense sophistication, lots of component parts working together with regularity and order. So how might that display purpose? Everything is for a particular end in order that information may be sent down the optic nerve to the brain to interpret. You might watch this video to give you some background. Task 3. What arguments might in the above video be brought forward as objections? Now, David Hume is a famous skeptic of the 18th century in Edinburgh. And Hume would say, we assume that the world is mechanical, but it might be better to look at nature, and particularly the eye, as something organic. Now, he's onto something there, because organic things can reproduce, and with reproduction there can be mutations and variation, and that could give rise to evolution. Hume hadn't thought that far, but in making that switch from the mechanical to the organic, the biological, he'd got a good nose, a good sense for what might change. Hume also says, it's all very well to say there's lots of beautiful stuff in the world, lots of design and order, but what about all of the terrible things, you know, the ducklings that have a broken leg and can't keep up with the rest of the ducks and get eaten by pikes underneath the water? What about all of the suffering that's caused by what we might say is inadequate design in nature? Hume objects to that, and he says we've not been there at the beginning of the universe. What would we know about the design and order in universes? Now, I want you to go on and look at Charles Darwin, and there's an introduction here, a wonderful introduction by Horrible Histories, quite an amusing song. And what you need to do below is just to link the key mechanisms of evolution. So natural selection is described here, but you need to link the other key mechanisms of evolution to their description on the right. That's a fairly straightforward task. Task 5. This is a really interesting clip about Alfred Russel Wallace. Now, he was a kind of collector of rare breeds and animals. He would sort of taxidermy them and send them back to wealthy collectors in Britain. And Alfred Russel Wallace started to get onto the theory of evolution with a kind of collector's general sense that something might be going on in terms of mutation and selection and characteristics of offspring reflecting those of their progenitors. And Darwin had been working systematically on this study for 20 years and had an extensive collection of evidence, but he was reluctant to publish, because he was meticulous and wanted to produce a perfect study, which eventually came out in 1859 in The Origin of the Species, but B, because his wife was religious and perhaps he was reluctant to, in his mind, destroy a literal reading of Genesis so exhaustively by his study. But Alfred Russel Wallace decided to send a report of his theory to Darwin, and Darwin was like, my goodness, you know, he's almost beat me to the punch. So the two of them went to, well, Russell was still out collecting in the other side of the world, but Darwin published or presented 2 papers at the Linnaeum Society in London at the same time. And today we don't even remember Alfred Russel Wallace, but he was also a figure there. Now, task 6. So your task there was to, just explain why Darwin went to publish those ideas. Darwin went as a young naturalist on this ship to accompany the captain, really, and be company for him, and to document this extraordinary voyage around the world, and particularly off the coast of Ecuador to the Galapagos Islands, which are a kind of archipelago of islands that have isolated species development, and so they're a great snapshot of evolutionary development. And what Darwin noted was the range of finches in these islands and how they specialized in different food types, and their beaks were perfectly adapted to those food types. So that got him thinking. The Galapagos finches, they're sometimes known as the Darwin finches now on Galapagos, about natural selection. Darwin also had an extensive collection of pigeons and bred them, and was able to accentuate certain characteristics, like kind of racing pigeons or bulbous necks or fan-tailed pigeons through selective breeding. And your task here is to how did this finding later provide evidence for his theory of evolution? So talk about how that provides evidence. Another source of evidence was the governor of the Galapagos Islands said to him that he could immediately identify which island one of the giant tortoises had come from, because they were adapted to access the vegetation on the island. So if it's a densely it's got dense sort of undergrowth, then you're going to need a shell that can kind of push through all of that. If there's very little vegetation and you've got to get for the higher reaching fruit, then those giant tortoises with the shells that are open could reach up extraordinary heights compared to these tortoises. So when he arrived home in 1836, Darwin sort of struck upon this idea of variation and the inheritance. He didn't know about genetics yet, but he knew about mutations and natural selection. So you need to simply explain what this would have meant for Darwin as he came back. And imagine you're Darwin returning from your voyage, draw a brainstorm diagram about what you're thinking about natural selection. Then task 8, in trying to persuade his father to allow him to go on the voyage, Darwin's uncle, Josiah Wedgwood, had noted that Charles was a man of enlarged curiosity, and he had the knack for asking the right questions during and after his 5-week visit to an extraordinary workshop of evolution. That's 5-year visit, sorry. To have a look at this. Maybe it's 5 weeks at the Galapagos Islands, sorry, it's a 3-year voyage. But he spent 5 weeks on the Galapagos Islands, sorry. Think of 2 questions that Darwin might have asked that led to his breakthrough discovery. So he might have asked, why is the wildlife in the Galapagos Islands very different to that in South America more generally? And that's because the distance is several hundred kilometers off the coast, and this was an isolated evolutionary snapshot. There was no kind of cross migration between populations, and islands had their own populations. So you could look at the environment and how the species had adapted specifically to each environment, and that told you quite a lot about how rapidly evolution could equip the flora and fauna for survival. That was the key thing about survival, what is needed to stay alive. A very famous philosopher and one of the major thinkers about how evolution impacts philosophy is Daniel Dennett. He wrote about Darwin's dangerous idea. He said it's the single best idea anyone has ever had, and it's the universal acid that eats through just about every traditional concept and leaves in its wake a revolutionized view. Can you think of 3 consequences of evolution by natural selection that it might have on wider aspects of life? Well, I think the first would be medicine. So genetics and everything from genetic profiling to understanding possible risks. So if you have a BRCA2 or BRCA1 gene, there's an increased risk of cancer. And we know we can use that information helpfully to treat people. So in medicine, evolution has had a huge impact. I think in the understanding of species and how we categorize species, that's had a huge impact on treatment of biology and sort of natural history. That's had a big impact. And the whole world of genetics is fascinating in terms of research, in terms of human DNA, family trees. That would have an impact. Those are just 3 areas. You could also say that once the evidence for evolution is overwhelming, a literal reading of Genesis becomes, if not untenable, very difficult intellectually to hold with integrity. So that, for our purposes, is a big influence. Task 10, nearly there now. Richard Dawkins has written, I can't imagine being an atheist any time before 1859 when Darwin's Origin of the Species was published. It's what gives intellectual respectability to atheism and agnosticism for Dawkins. Why do many atheists like Dawkins see Darwin's natural explanation for the origin of life as doing God out of a job and plugging mysterious gaps in our understanding that he once filled? Well, the God of the gaps explanation is to say that whenever there's a mystery in science, theists have traditionally been quite apt to sort of jump in there with God. God plugs the gaps. And that seems to make room for God. But the problem with it is, as science advances, God gets squeezed out of the gaps. So it's a bit of a bad strategy, the God of the gaps strategy. And it's a short-lived success that theism enjoys there. So why do many atheists like Dawkins see Darwin's natural explanation for the origin of life doing God out of the job? Because biology has provided a fairly exhaustive explanation from the primeval soup and primitive amoeba to human beings and their evolution. And so we can, within a natural framework, not a supernatural, within a natural framework of biology and genetics, we can have an explanation for human origins. And that, for Dawkins, seems to do God out of the job. Task 11. Darwin's loss of faith came as much as a result of his beloved daughter Annie's death as any intellectual does that he held. She had suffered from ill health for a long time, and in 1851, Darwin watched her waste away from a fever, and it destroyed his faith in a loving and just God. As he wrote, I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created a wasp that could do the evil that it does. Just read the or watch that clip there that tells you about the I can't pronounce that Latin word, but that wasp, which he sees as part and parcel of evolution, which doesn't pose a problem if evolution is just part of the blind forces of nature. But if it's part of the beneficent, the good and just work of God, then it's a problem. My theology is a simple model. I cannot look at the universe as a result of blind chance, yet I cannot see evidence of a beneficent design. I feel compelled to look for a first cause. We've been talking about the cosmological argument. Having an intelligent mind, I deserve to be called a theist. The mystery of the beginning of all things is insoluble by us, and I, for one, must be content to remain an agnostic. It was religious or atheistic dogmatism, insistence on the rightness of one's beliefs, that upset Darwin, who cautioned an atheist friend, why should you be so aggressive? If anything, is anything gained by trying to force these new ideas upon the mass of mankind? So task 11, in cases where people lose their faith in God through doubt, is this mainly because A, suffering and evil, B, doubts about science and religion, C, something else? Just pick one and give your reasons for it. And finally, task 12. Darwin saw his ideas about God as a model, and he shifted from theism to agnosticism, belief in God, a personal God, a creator God, to I don't know. There's not sufficient evidence, and so we should just keep an open mind and not necessarily be dogmatic atheists or dogmatic theists, just say there's insufficient evidence to judge either way. So in this, as he got older, but couldn't quite shake off some sense of an intelligent first cause, can you define the terms below? And do you think other people are a simple model holding to two positions or shifting between them? So an atheist is convinced that there isn't a God. That's a faith position. It's a belief system that there is no God. An agnostic says, as there's insufficient evidence, I don't know, right? Gnosis is to know. A negates something like a theist, and a gnosis, I don't know. A deist is someone who believes that God made the universe, but he's impersonal. He doesn't care about human beings. He's not emotional and personal. He doesn't want to relate to human beings. He just leaves the universe to do its own thing along mechanical lines. He stays out. There are no miracles. There's no prophets. God doesn't get involved after he's created the universe. And a theist is someone who believes that God creates the world, but he's personal and he does get involved in it. Those are a lot of questions to get through. And I anticipate that if you get started on Thursday, that's going to take you all of Thursday and all of Friday's lessons to complete. So have a go at that and see how you get on.